we're back to Symbols 10, and we're pushing our appreciation almost to a liminal aspect of the world. One of the most difficult things of the early 21st century is to begin to get over the 20th century. And the 20th century was a classic labyrinth because it had two supposedly incommensurate qualities that could not be reconciled and were held to be mutually exclusive in polarity. And so we need to take a look from the early 21st century and look back through the 20th century to see how it got that way. And when we do, the 2 centuries before the 20th century, the 19th and then the 18th, reveal to us, as if we were like archaeologists going back through the levels to see, well, what was built here before that? Or like geologists to see what are the geological strata and how does this add up, and where are we now then? And we talked last week about the great Archimedean screw principle, that when you go into something in this spiraling way, it brings up the previous levels and layers without distorting them. That just trying to bludgeon one's way in shatters the striations so that you just get a mess, a chaos. And part of the 20th century's difficulty is that it produced a nightmare of chaos. And so we, in this century, need to wake up from that nightmare mess. And part of the way to do that is to get this spiraling penetration back through different layers of time, and not just time, but the people who were there and what they were doing and what they were thinking about, and the traditional academic ascription to the problems of the modern world dated back to the 17th century, back to the 1600s. And they say, well, the 1600s are the origin of science, and that's where a lot of difficulties have come. But the 16th century is parallel with the 17th century, and once you understand history, you get a different view. It's the 18th and 19th century that are difficult. And so we're taking two figures, one who is a visionary man of the 18th century, William Blake, and one who is a visionary man of the 19th century, W.B. Yeats. And we're pairing Blake and Yeats to hold them not as like goalposts that we're trying to get to understand them, but we're using their pairedness as if it were like a gateway, as if it were characterizing a threshold beyond which the 20th century came into its nightmare mess. And so we're trying to look back all the way through the 20th century to see at its beginnings what was happening, say in 1899, that was so characteristic and important and significant. And in 1899, in the summer, in June, E.A. Wallace Budge published this elephant folio of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And we talked about him a little bit last week, of how he was singled out as a teenager as being a prodigy, and how a lot of very wealthy, powerful English men who wanted to outdo the new occult empire that the French after Napoleon bringing Egyptology onto the scene, the British wanted to take that and run with the ball. And so they wanted to train someone who would be the best Egyptologist in the world. And so they trained E.A. Wallace Budge. The people who sponsored him were truly formidable people. One of his sponsors was Gladstone, who was the British Prime Minister. Another was Samuel Birch, who was the keeper of the British Museum. And he had several royals behind him, and all of them made it possible for him, carte blanche, to study and study until he became perhaps the greatest linguist in the world. He could read any ancient language: Arabic, Greek, Syriac, Hebrew. His Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, as we said, is still in print in 2 volumes. Coptic, he could read them all. Latin, the entire range. So when he became keeper himself of the antiquities at the British Museum in the mid-1890s, he published this Egyptian Book of the Dead to serve notice that the British Empire was the most occult, savvy empire in world history, and they deserved to rule the world. It was a big statement. It was a declaration of empire based on the fact that we have it all put together. And the Victorian English saying at the time was that the rest of mankind is subject perhaps to evolution, but not the British Empire. We have emerged, we have crawled ashore, we are here, we have arrived. And so in 1900, the British pride was that we have arrived at the pinnacle, and the British Empire is such that the sun never sets on it. We exceed the day and the night, and the entire world is within our purview. This does go back 300 years. It does go back to Renaissance Elizabethan England, and it does go back to when Shakespeare and his group and company built a new theater for themselves. They called it the Globe, the world. Because at that time, the big news was the development of marine navigation on the surface of the sphere, on the surface of the whole planet. And that was developed by John Dee, the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth. And his early triumph was a book on the principles of spherical navigation that allowed the British Navy and pirates and privateers to sail anywhere in the globe and to know where they were and where they were going. But the difficulty of all this is exacerbated because at the end of the 1600s, going into the 18th century, the most powerful book published was Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. And it's in between the Principia Mathematica of Newton and the Egyptian Book of the Dead of Sir Wallace Budge that you find an increasing polarity that put its rhizomes out and its roots down, and when it came into fruition, that deep antagonistic polarity produced poison fruit in the 20th century. It branched off science into an abstract, increasingly impersonal ritual. And on the other side, opposed to it, was increasing metaphysical, mystical systems that transcended mere science. And one had to go back to the primordial qualities of ourselves And in this, the 20th century, and these primordial qualities of ourselves in the 19th century were called primitive. And part of the difficulty in the 19th century was that the sense of primitive being ascribed to other people is very much in keeping with the way in which all apexes of empires considered people outside of their purview to be barbarians. And so most of the people of the world in the 19th century who were not in urban European cities were considered barbarians. Whether you were in Africa or in Asia or South America or even people just on the street, almost everybody except the privileged hierarchy were common, perhaps barbarians. And they deserve to be saved in the sense that we will organize for them and plan for them, and then they will be under our care and tutelage, and for a fee, we will maintain this. And so at the beginning of the 21st century, this mentality now has become worldwide, it's become global. And the New World Order is simply a rehash of the way in which these characterizations have happened throughout civilized history. It is a dull repeat, only this time the dull repeat has a difficulty with it. We can now analytically create forms on the subatomic and submolecular levels. And so we can change literally the way in which things are written out of creation. There's a popular electron photograph of the initials of IBM spelled out with atoms. And so we need to wake up from not only the nightmare of the 20th century and its confusion, but to also not get caught in that divisive polarity that the 19th and the 18th centuries developed, and to go back further and further in a special way, this Archimedean screw, this spiraling principle, because in this way we will be able to investigate and bring up. And what we investigate and bring up, if we go by a chronological order, we will miss its actuality and fall into an idea called historicism. If we choose some kind of metaphysical doctrine, we will produce a symbolic understanding, which again is a mental structure purely, and its function amounts to that of a game. And so we need to keep away from the whole bag of bad habit tricks. And so we're using something new here. Something new which is a development of several orders from antiquity going back several thousand years. When you come to the works of Archimedes, translated by T.H. Heath, Cambridge, 1897, just about the time Budge is working on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, just about the time that Yeats is putting out his great book on Blake with John Ellis, just about the time that X-rays are being discovered and radioactivity for the first time is yielding to Madame Curie that there's something mysterious in radium, and there's something mysterious in several very high-end elements, uranium and thorium, that they have radioactivity within them, and that obviously there are energies and forces stronger than the forms of existence to hold them. It's a very powerful realization that the forms of existence themselves cannot seal nor protect its structure from energies which are more powerful than those forms. And so the 20th century began by not only being divisive and polarized in such a confused, chaotic way that it turned into a nightmare, but it was a nightmare haunted by the practical discovery that the universe contains forces much stronger than any forms of existence. And so as to make up for that, forms of the symbolic mind were strengthened and strengthened until they became these kinds of super existence doctrines, like developed by the Nazis or the communists, or all the isms that we will develop mental symbolic forms that are strong enough to protect us from the wild energies of the universe. And we'll take shelter within this strength of our symbolic doctrines and existence. And it's apparent by the early 21st century that these symbolic forms are even more perforated than the forms of existence and subject to massive dissolve by the late 1920s, after the first kinds of radiation were worked with by Lord Rutherford and his laboratories in Canada, in Montreal, at McGill, and then in Britain at Manchester, and later at the Cavendish in Cambridge, and surrounded and complemented by a number of talented individuals, one of whom was Niels Bohr, coming over from Denmark. The discovery that there was an alpha radiation, which turned out to be the nucleuses of helium, and beta radiation, that was the electron streams coming, that there was a third kind of radiation called gamma radiation that is many times more powerful and penetrates the universe in such a way that if you could see energy instead of forms, the entire universe would be in a blizzard of gamma radiation. There's no protection from it. And that this is not a bad thing, but it yields then the realization that the entire universe is awash with energy. And therefore, we have developed within that energy, and therefore it is a basic quality that is there in the reality of our existence, in the reality of our minds, in the reality of our cultures and civilizations, and that we need to get over the false idea that somehow energy is inimical to life. That radiation actually, as the word shows, is a radiance. And one of the deep realizations by the early 21st century is that radiation, is a differential form of energy, not an integral form of energy. The integral forms of energy are where things cinch together and become existential things, or where experience comes together and forms and becomes the mind as a structure. But that there are two kinds of forms that are not integral, that are outside this, that come from a radiance, a differential. One of them is the form of the person, as distinct from any integral, and the other is the form of the cosmos, also not integral but differential, and that differential forms do not have a structure so much as they have a calibration of possibilities, and that calibration of possibilities is able to be further differentiated all the time indefinitely. And that the forms of art, like the person, are differentiated more and more by critique, and that the forms of science are differentiated more and more by analytics. And by having a critiquable form of art and an analytic form of science, you don't align them like integrals, but you allow them to go into their resonant harmonic sets and establish their weaving, their possibilities. The difficulty of the 18th century is that this was exactly what was implied by Newton's Principia Mathematica. But it was presented so abstrusely precise that there were only a handful of people who were able to read it at all. I remember as a boy being told there are only 6 people in the world who understand Einstein. Yes, it's important, but we don't know really what it is. It was the same thing in the early 1700s. It took about 2 generations for it to sink in, for discussion, for use of it to finally begin to dawn on enough people, and when it did, it produced a phenomena that was catastrophic in the 1700s. It broke permanently the confidence in a very capable strata of men and women. It broke their confidence that any of the social forms were able to hold. That even the universal forms were questionable. And out of this came the age of revolutions. Directly. There was a wonderful woman, Marjorie Nicholson, who wrote a couple of fantastic books about that era and about that happening. One of them was Voyages to the Moon, a compilation of all the historical developments of leaving the Earth and going to another planet. Another one was Newton Demands the Muse, the effect on poetry in the 1700s. And the third was called The Breaking of the Circle. And it is the breaking of the circle that yields William Blake most profoundly. Blake's whole orientation was to try to find a way to regenerate a new vision out of the ruins that Newton's mechanistic universe had thrown it, and that the age of revolution now was struggling with because all of his friends were revolutionaries. He did some of the first illustrations to Mary Wollstonecraft's book, Vindications of the Rights of Women, A Revolution of Gender. Tom Paine was one of his close friends and associates, and many of those individuals where the young Blake was, followers of Swedenborg, followers of different revolutionary excursions to try and find something new. And it was finally Blake, because he was a mystic, a talented mystic, who also, being apprenticed from age 16 to be an engraver, and not just an engraver, but assigned to engrave the interior of Westminster Abbey, that the entirety of Gothic living form and detailed line flows with a new, creative, energetic vision and mythological imagination, Blake began to produce not just poems, but prophetic books. Poems as prophecies. Prophecies of something that never was before and now must be. in a valiant attempt to overcome the mechanistic reduction of the world to the gears of a Newtonian universe. In the midst of all of that, by the late 1700s, you began to have individuals who were radical almost to an extreme. You found young, wealthy, supposedly gentlemen like Percy Shelley, who's experimenting with electricity and chemicals and blew up a room in one of his father's estates and was almost disowned because of it, and who even just a decade or so later was enthusing his wife Mary to write Frankenstein, the Superman created by electrical energy out of piecing the bits of an old person back together in our new way, a Superman. And so you have, at this time, this incredible crunch of things. You have people who become extremely scientific and mechanical, and people who become extremely metaphysical and poetical, and two individuals characterize that very succinctly. One is the poet Wordsworth, who becomes a transcendent nature poet, and Sir Humphrey Davies, who becomes a scientist trying to develop chemical theory and magnetic theory and electric theory, and all the time a bigger and wider split was happening between them. And in between, falling in between the cracks of those two camps, was William Blake, who in his time was almost non-appreciated. There were less than a handful of people who appreciated him in his lifetime. He was very much like Newton in that respect, that there were very few people who could understand what he was saying, what he was getting at. But towards the end of the 1800s, about 50 years after he died, increasingly he was rediscovered, but he was rediscovered in a way that he was a forebearer of seeing that one needed to have a new vision, that the imagination and energy had to be brought into play in a new way. But by then, the scope had widened. It wasn't just Newton's mechanistic Principia Mathematica making foment in our lives, in our cultures, in our civilizations with revolution, the age of revolution, but that there was an even deeper, more expanded, wider, more important discovery, and that was the entire history of so-called civilization was minuscule compared to the reality of man's antiquity. That the enormity of what was real on this planet exceeded the problems of civilization by many thousands of times. One of the first gongs that struck was Darwin's evolutionary book on the origin of species, 1859, saying, we have evolved for who knows how long, not just thousands of years, not even just millions of years, but hundreds of millions of years. And who knows if it doesn't go into the billions, which very quickly in the 20th century it was realized it goes all the way back, at least 3 billion years. So the scale dwarfed everything, but the scale came and just fed into a polarity already. And what happens when you get an expansion of a polarity is that you get an inflation that verges from the neurotic into the psychotic. And so the world by 2004 is very close to a psychotic condition. As a doctor of civilization, one would diagnose the patient as ready to crack up. Indeed. And one would like to say for a fee you could be cured, but apparently there isn't enough money in the world to pay that fee. So we have to do it a different way. We have to get unsick without taking a cure, which means we have to go back in such a way that we re-emerge all the way without developing the illness. And that's what we're doing in this education, this learning. We're coming back through all of the levels, all of the problems, all of the integrals first, and then all of the differentials, so that we can appreciate where it is that we are and discover that we are wherever we are actually living our lives and exploring our consciousness. One of the discoveries in Egyptology by the time of 1899, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it was realized that there was a very deep quality to the development of Egyptian history that was exceedingly mysterious and still hasn't been put out in the full public recognition. The mysteriousness goes back in the popular 20th century version of the three great pyramids at Giza, and how those three great pyramids at Giza are like the three stars in the belt of Orion. But by the early 21st century, we're able to realize that those pyramids had prototypes. It wasn't just that pyramids had prototypes. The first real true pyramid dates from the beginning of the 4th dynasty, Snofru. He tried to make a true pyramid instead of a stepped pyramid. The stepped pyramids come from the Euphrates and Tigris valleys. They were the ziggurats. They were the spiral that goes up, the spiraling tower that goes up, and so that we go throughout all the levels of the celestial powers in between man and God, and when we get to the top of that Archimedean ziggurat screw, we will have penetrated into heaven, and to the very top, that we will have understood then God direct. And the ziggurat in Egypt, by the time of Zoser, about 2630 BC, was already trying to build a stepped pyramid at the center of a walled enclave. But very soon after that, within 50 years, Snofru realized that the geometry of this was wrong, that one doesn't move by steps imitating a spiral, but that one needed to have a perfected solid form that was geometrically succinct so that it could make a ground line for the development of a whole geometric symbolic mentality that would be able then to develop into in the spiraling way, into a true, perfect symbolic form. And at that true, ultimate symbolic form, that would be the top of the spiral and not some kind of artifice, some kind of edifice. And the first real pyramid was the Red Pyramid that Snofru built just south of the rather north of the Step Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid is the first true pyramid in the world. And just to the north of that, you find the prototype of the Giza pyramids. You find 3 pyramids in a row that are like the stars of Orion, but they're smaller, and they go back quite primordially. And those 3 pyramids are in a cluster called the Abbasir Pyramids. And Abbasir is very famous in archaic Egypt. There are two Abbasirs. One is where those three pyramids are together on the west bank of the Nile, and the other is west of Alexandria, about 25 miles. And that Abbasir, in more recent Egyptian times, was called Taposiris Magna. And Taposiris Magna is the place mythologically in the Osirian resurrection cycle that one is able to go back into a rebirth quality and come back out again. And it's at Taposiris Magna that the therapeutic community was located, where Jesus taught for many decades. Right at the site and the spot which was like resurrection central for thousands of years, the very place. What was interesting about it is that the resurrection central is on the west side of the Nile Delta, not just on the west bank of the Nile River, but on the west side of the entire Nile Delta. Now, the ancient Egyptian cosmology was always that the sun, as everyone knows, rises in the east, so that if you're going to rise, you're going to have to rise from the east. And the sunset is in the west. And there were two, they were called atubui, these little gates. They're always paired together, and it means that between these two gates, there's a tunnel, and that this tunnel goes underneath the Nile, and so that Ra is able to rise in the east, go over the canopy of the sky and set in the west, and go through this tunnel, through these two gates, and come back up again. And that this was the model for resurrection, that to get resurrected, you have to go counterclockwise of what the day goes. The day integrates, but the netherworld differentiates. And so you have to be able to go differentially through that tunnel to rise again. And that resurrection is a very complicated problem. It means that you have to be able to go through the entire counterclockwise cycle, which initially, we talked about last week, had 12 gates. And each gate had a watcher. And asked you a riddle, asked you a question. And if you couldn't reply correctly, you were stopped there. No resurrection. In fact, you were fed to the demons. So it was a very perilous journey. And you had to be able to go all the way through. And the only way to go all the way through was that you could not rote memorize something. You had to have an internal watcher in yourself who was memory itself. And that internal watcher was called in ancient Egypt the Ba spirit. And the Ba spirit, the translation in the 19th century was the soul. The Ba is related to but distinct from the Ka. The Ka is the life spirit, but the Ba is the soul spirit. And not only is there a Ka, but the Ka has what was called in the 19th century a shadow. And the Ba has its kind of shadow, but it isn't really, they are not really shadows. But the shadow, so to speak, of the Ba was the name. So you had a pair of pairs. You had a life force that had a, quote, shadow, and you had a soul force which had its name. And you had to get both these together in the same reference, not only on the same page, but in the same plane. And then you had to take this plane and make it have a circumambulation in a complete sphere. And it was that esoteric problem that begins Archimedes on the sphere, written both in Alexandria and ancient Syracuse some 2,000 years ago. When we come back, we'll take another look at it. This is a double page from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is the psychostasia, the weighing of the soul. What's interesting here is that the soul, for the ancient Egyptians, was the heart. In the 19th century, they said, well, it's where the intelligence is, that the soul, the Ba, is there in the heart, and from that came the phrase wisdom of the heart. It's more proper and deeper and of a high dharma to understand that the heart is not the seat of intelligence, but the seat of sentience. Sentience is a process flow, whereas intelligence is a formed structure. They're related, but they're distinct. They're different. The form of the mind, being an intelligent form, emerges out of the sentient flow of experience. It's the enrichment of the flow of experience that gives the source for the depth of the mind and the strength of its structure. So that you cannot train the mind to be strong in symbols, in symbolic terms. The strengthening of the structure of the mind and the depth of the mind is the enriching of experience and the increasing of its flow. It's like a chi, or like a key. And experience has to be free to flow. Otherwise, it can't carry an enriched quality of images and feelings. The way in which one can gauge how the flow of experience is free is by an oral language to be spontaneous. This is ancient wisdom. If one is not able to be spontaneous in your speaking, in your oral language, then there are limitations and there are compartmentalizations of your experience that is stopping that, hindering that. So that the ancient form of prayer was not that you followed a rote prayer, but that you created a spontaneous prayer. That spontaneous prayer in ancient times was called a song. In ancient Iran, it was called a gatha. In parts of the ancient world, it was given the term hymn. It means also prayer. It means that spontaneous prayer that is not interruptible from your own experience is a sign of the openness of the entire process, the entire horizon, as it were, of mythology. If you have a doctrinaire imposition on the mythic horizon, your language will become compartmentalized and it will involve a kind of a stutter or a misstatement or an inability to continue. So that in ancient Greek Orthodox Christianity, for instance, the hallmark of someone who was holy was that they were able to utter a prayer without end. It's called the philokalia. It means that one is a friend of God in the sense that one's experience is horizon-free forever, and one could pray without end. So that a life lived within that is a life that is woven in the flow of the openness of the mythic horizon. But the mythic horizon by itself skews off from its openness, from its flow, because it is generated by ritual actions, by ritual doings. So that it was very important to make sure that your rituals were of such that it delivered the base upon which experience could flow uninterrupted. The mythic horizon could be free. And the understanding in ancient wisdom was that rituals that are artificial will not do that. They cannot do that. They, in fact, do not ever do that. So that the rituals must emerge out of a flow that delivers them pristine, and that flow is nature. So that the ancient understanding was quite clear and quite simple, but mysterious to us because we're not used to wisdom. The flow of cultural experience needed to be concomitant and parallel to the flow of natural mystery, so that nature and culture as two processes flowed together, and that the horizon of nature and the horizon of experience, because they were flowing together, were like continuous banks that allowed the emergence of the ritual forms of existence to be distinct and formed and definite, because they emerged out of the continuous flow. It's like the obverse of a river where the banks are solid and the river is a flow. This is the celestial river where the banks are flowing and what's in between them is stable, is solid, is trustworthy. So that the paradigm of it then in the ancient Egyptian wisdom was that the most primordial of all occurrences is how existence comes out of nature and out of the flow of culture and nature together, that the existential existence can come out in such a way that not only is it solid ritually, but one could build upon that solidity a symbolic architecture. Yeah. And that symbolic architecture has a deep woven complexity in it. So that one finds in the earliest Egyptian theology the creation of an island out of the flood of the Nile is exactly the symbolic replay of the conditions of how nature and culture in unison produce a ritual existence that will support a symbolic architecture of a more complex nature. And that island was located in the Nile River, right where the delta of the Nile begins, and the city that was built there was called Memphis. Before the Nile was livable as a river system, back about 15,000 BC, it was a very long, elongated swamp. The Nile level was much higher because the northern part of Africa had not desiccated yet. And the large populations were in the Sahara Desert before it was a desert. But by about 10,000 BC, the whole north of Africa began drying out. And as it began to desiccate, the Nile riverine valley, instead of being like a swamp with lots of wild grasses around it, became more and more a river surrounded by arable lands. And so one had the movement between 15,000 and 10,000 BC of people leaving the interior of the Sahara and coming to the ridges of the entire Nile riverine system. And then after about 10,000 BC, increasingly, as the Nile shrank, they moved from the ridges onto the arable land. And by about 3000 BC, Egypt came into being as a civilization based on that new structure. But the first two dynasties in ancient Egypt were still resonantly akin to the ancient Sahara culture. Whereas in the third dynasty, there was an abrupt symbolic change that changed it forever. And ever since then, Egypt has been a civilization based on an understanding of symbols and their ecology, rather than a culture based on the nomadic gathering life patterns that had been there for literally tens of thousands of years. Just a brief recap, our species, Homo sapiens, came emerging into species about 160,000 years ago. The earliest traces of that are, of course, in Africa, but the first time that there's a beginnings of a difference, a major difference in our species, is about 70,000 years ago in southern Africa, South Africa, as a matter of fact. And there, for the very first time, you find the first indications of carved shell beads, of carved ivory tools, of bone tools. You begin to see that people, men and women, are aware of, at the same time, technical improvements and cosmetic adornment. So the art of fashionability and the techniques, the technicalities of an improved science occur together. The arts and sciences always occur together because they're harmonic. They're never at war with each other. It is only a mistaken idea of crippling, neurotic stupidness that makes the arts and sciences opposed. And whenever they have been brought back together, that era has been called, we call it what the 19th century historian Burckhardt called it, a Renaissance. And there have been many Renaissances in many places. In ancient times, in China, Iran, India. The Northern Italian Renaissance is just the latest. And it always is a re-resonancing of the forms of art and science, of critiquable forms and of analytic forms within a larger complementarity that includes the natural ecology, where not only do nature and culture flow together, but the symbols are able to formally structure themselves on ritual foundations that hold, so that the mind becomes a natural form that is the final integral for all of the formal existences that are there. The mind literally indexes the reality of existence in its form at that motion. It is not the hierarchy over it. It's not the ruler of it, but it is the integral of it and indexes it so that all of the qualities of its form, its entire architecture, very naturally show the ritual clarity and the existential solidity of its foundations, and exemplify the way in which nature and culture flow together in a participatory parallel, so that one then has a natural ecology of nature, ritual, myth, and symbol that is not circular, but has a very slight spiraling quality to it. It's always there. It's never circular. If it is circular, if it is mechanically circular, then there's an impairment in the mind. Then the symbols are not healthy, and the rituals are rote. And it isn't that culture flows with nature, but that it contorts itself to repeat what the tyranny of the misformed mind inculcates on the misformed actions of existence. And one says then that society is ill, is sick. We live in a world where there is no healthy society on the planet. None whatsoever. And so we're involved in doing the very practical thing. For a new, healthy planet to come out, it needs new people who can go back and comb out through all the integrals and reestablish not only themselves, but their relationships with each other on the whole parfait of all the levels. And this is a very difficult thing to do. It was apparent to people like W.B. Yeats that this showed that in their time, the basic problem was with symbols, whereas our basic problem now at the beginning of the 21st century is not with symbols, but with history. And so our problem is with one of the differential flows, like nature and culture are integral processes. Consciousness and civilization, vision and history are differential processes. And the mistake of thinking that history is a form is a presumptive projection of a misshapen mind. To think that history is not a process that is highly differentiable, has all kinds of possibilities of not only being seen and interpreted in different ways, but that this is a healthy quality. And so one has to learn that history involves not only the flow of a very high differential consciousness called civilization, but that civilization is not an empire. That is the direct sabotage. History as a process is not an empire form that the mind commandeers. And this is, of course, paradoxical, because almost all of the tradition that we misshapenly inherit today is crucially scrambled by all of this. Many times over, many levels, it is impossible for the mind by itself, symbolically, to restore its form to naturalness. And so what happens in this case, and this has been the case many times on this planet, and our kind have always come through, what is needed is a third process called vision, called consciousness, to come into play, because consciousness is able to have a parallel with nature of a different kind. While the process of mythic experience flows the same way as nature, differential consciousness flows in a complementarity to it, flows in a different way. So that when it comes into play with nature, it comes into play not to participate and follow nature, but comes into a transform interplay with nature. So that nature now does something very mysterious. It likes to flow with culture, but it likes to transform with consciousness. And so nature becomes not just natural, but becomes also, the ancient saying was, magical. It's capable not of just producing existential forms, but of producing transformable variants of existential forms. This is the very basis of the way in which both art and science emerge. Art emerges from the magic of visionary consciousness, and science emerges from the high civilized historical process. There's a very deep realization and understanding. In Yeats's time, with the Egyptian Book of the Dead coming out, with the understandings that almost all of the elements by 1900 showed that the origins of all Western civilizations went back and were centered not just on Egypt, but they were coordinated so that they were calibrated to what we could understand by Egypt. So that once we understood the Egyptian chronology, the Egyptian symbols, we could then use that as a template by which to read the others. Ancient Indus civilization of India, the ancient China, the ancient Iran, etc. What came into play as that happened is that the ability to develop critique forms, art, became exponentially expanded. At the same time that one has the Egyptian Book of the Dead coming out, one has a genius like Claude Monet, who starts painting a haystack, and he keeps on painting the same haystack, but at different times of the day, different seasons of the year, and begins to show that there is a reality to that haystack that is expandable from just the perception of it or just the conception of it. It's expandable in the sense that the figuration of its existence is transformably much wider and much richer than just the configuration of it in one's momentary experience. And so experience has to expand. It isn't just for the moment. It isn't just for this season, just for this year, just for this lifetime, just for this culture, but it's expandable, and so that one finds that the human being is capable of enormous differential complexity. They can not only have many lives, but they can be many variants of many different lives, and all at the same time. One doesn't exclude the other because it isn't limited to an existential, integral structure. It's transformable all the time in unending, unbounded creativity. So that Yeats, when he looked at Blake not seeing the man fighting a revolution against the mechanical Newtonian universe, but at someone who had hold of the dragon's tail. Because for Blake, the two elements that were somehow involved were energy and imagination. If you had a pure enough energy that was unencumbered by false society, and you had a freed imagination that was not encumbered by a false mentality, then the constraints of society and a misshapen mind would be obviated enough to allow for energy and imagination to play in new ways, and that the imagination had something to do with vision. It didn't have to do so much with the symbolic mind as it had to do, we would call it now visionary consciousness. He called it vision. And so when it came time for him to do his great Book of Job, it was the vision of the Book of Job. And here's where a great deal of complexity came into play that Blake had, no one in his time had any idea of whatsoever. that they were opening a Pandora's box. We talked a little bit last week of how the book of Job came to be written, and we have to go back over that again a little bit deeper, a little more expansive, so we can appreciate the complexity that was going on. And by the time it got to Yeats, the complexity exceeded the ability of the symbolic mind to keep track of it. They lost track of it. And a great deal of the nightmare of the 20th century is because the most talented people were suffering, being lost almost seemingly permanently, beyond hope. And so part of the good news of the early 21st century of teachers is to say, we were not lost. We were just stewing in a very great complexity, which we now can understand. Not by the mind alone, but by an entire 8-phase ecology of not only all of nature, but all of the ecology of the phases of consciousness as well as it develops into the cosmos. So we're looking at an 8-fold structure, and when we do this, we come back to one of the 2 main themes in ancient Egypt. One theme was that the set of symbolicness that counted was a set of 8. It's called in the Greek pronunciation of the ancient Egyptian, it was called the Ogdode, the 8. There were 4 pairs of gods who formed an Ogdode, and this Ogdode came out of a primordial, mysterious, murky, watery infinity. And the creator who brought that out was Ta, later personified in a conscious way as Thoth. That Thoth was able to give symbolic, written architectural expression to what Ta, as a primordial existential creator, brought out in the ritual actions of creation originally. And the whole iconography of it solidified around a city called Hermopolis. Hermopolis is the city of Hermes in Egypt, on the west bank of the Nile, located about halfway between Memphis and the Giza Pyramids and Abydos and the original Assyrian, the origins of pre-dynastic Egyptian religion. In the city of Hermes, the Ogdode was the way in which the cosmology was understood, that it was 4 pairs that unfolded and were related by a creative imagination that came through into play. The other was a 9-fold. It's called the Aeneid, not the Ogdode. And it was located in Heliopolis. The Greeks called it Heliopolis, the city of the sun. One was a city of Hermes that was an 8-fold. The other was a city of Ra, of Re, was a 9-fold. And that Aeneid included 4 pairs as well as a 9th that was like an overseer that was really there also at the origin, so that the 9th was the context before and after continuously. And that 9th was not pronounceable, was not nameable, except in a symbolic way and for ritual purposes. One said that universal creator was Amun. Amun. And out of Amun came 4 pairs that were not together as an Ogdode, but 4 pairs that developed phases. The first pair, Shu and Tefnut. Tefne in Egyptian is the root for the verb to rise. So her name means literally one whose function is to be risen. And she was one of the portals out of which Ra will rise each day. And Shu is the other portal, allowing for a sunset going into the netherworld in such a way that one could traverse the netherworld and rise out again. Not going down to die, but going down to go through the gamut of possible resurrection. So they, as guardians, but they were guardians of the horizon, but the horizon had this quality where there was earth and there was the heavens, the celestial heavens. So the second pair is a phase that emerges out of Shu and Tefnut. You have Geb, the earth, and you have Nut, the sky. The sky is feminine. And she arches her entire body, her fruitful celestial body, over the earth, and so on the inside of the lid of a sarcophagus one would find Nut, who's there. She guarantees that this part of the parenthesis is in place, and that Geb's earth part is in place because the sarcophagus is going to be placed underground, down into the earth. And then the next pairs that come out are Cyrus and Isis, and Nephthys and Seth. And so you get the Heliopolitan 9 and the Hermetic 8, and somehow they're related because the Hermetic 8 goes by the calibration of the lunar cycle. Thoth and Hermes are always related to the moon, whereas the 9, the Aeneid, is related to the sun. And so the great synthesis is to bring the lunar and the solar together in such a way that they make a more in-depth calendar, a fuller dimensional cosmology that one now sees the interplay. And as soon as you do, what interplays as well as the sun and the moon, and the cycles of Hermes and of Ra, when they're brought together, the planets now play a very huge role. And the 5 planets come in and participate with the sun and the moon in a new structure. And the Greek word in ancient wisdom for that new 7-fold structure was the hymarmene. It meant the basic principle of structuring, of creation, has a 7-level quality to it. And out of this, you get the development of astrology that takes the planets in consideration as well as the sun and the moon. And you get a very complex quality. The parallel to it is the way in which alchemy changes. Alchemy in the new in-depth synthesis is no longer just concerned with metals or, on the other hand, with minerals. The concern of alchemy with minerals is the concern for medicine, health, immortality. And the concern with metals is the gold, the silver, the baser metals. But when they're brought together, a new third quality comes into play, and that is the release of the spirit in such a way that it is resonant with the entire cosmos differentially. And so one now has very, very, very complex. The difficulty was that there was no way in which it could be taught. It certainly was never offered en masse. What was offered were the ritual forms, the initiatory forms, places where one could experience the mystery, and then symbolic qualities that one could carry around like amulets and talismans to assure yourself, pinch yourself that this really had happened. So that in between ritual bases of mysteries and mythic language imaged bases of the symbolic mind, you had them seeking to find some way to be aligned together. And when they were, one developed this equilibrium, the calmness of the balance of the two. And this is the way that almost all ancient cultures became higher civilizations, almost all of them. The difficulty in it is that if they're not handled in a conscientious way all the way through the entire ecology, then they begin to skew in such a way that they are not self-correcting. If the rituals become rote, they're already misleading you and deceiving you just by their roteness. Even though you got the ritual right, you repeated it exactly as your parents did it. But for you to repeat it exactly as they did it is already a distortion. Understand? So that the distortions constantly come into play in a natural way. So that one of the qualities that vision brings into play all the time is the realization that they need to be adjusted and corrected for all the time. That the course trajectory is not perfect and just going to work exactly right, but it's always going to have a bit of unique adjustment to it. Every single person has their own unique variation on it. And so higher civilizations that don't respect the variance of human beings is on many levels and many orders ignorant. So the ancient wisdom re-education was always to come back and bring a fifth dimension of consciousness into play in the natural ecology so that everything is available to be transformed but not distorted. So that ritual existence is indeed existentially true, and that symbolic forms are indeed stable in the mind, and that the culture and nature do flow together. But that all of them have now an orchestrated creativeness to them of the creative imagination that is at play within them. And in order to make that stable, the spiritual person as an art form is made not like something that comes together like that, but as a lens, like a prism. It's like the inner eye of seeing, so that one sees prismatically the harmony, the harmonia of the array of the possibilities, and is able to play with the transforms, not in a rational way, but in an artistic way. One deals with the living light then, the living rainbow, and one of the qualities one finds in Archimedes. As soon as one begins to understand the sphere of the real and the rotation of the plane of the perspective within it, the whole phenomenon of seeing is no longer a line of vision, but is a cone of light. And out of this comes the development in Alexandria about the 1st century AD of the first development of conic sections, that light, both scientifically and mystically, artistically and cosmically, as well as perceptually and conceptually, that light travels in its light cones. And this is held all the way into the 21st century. A great deal of what Einstein worked with is the ability to creatively think in terms of not just cones in this kind of geometric with trigonometric functions, but to see it with a differential consciousness that is raised to the literally to an infinite level. It's a lot. That's why it takes a while.